Greetings everyone, welcome to the 12th episode of Churches of Wales Season 1. In this series, I take a look at buildings part of the Church in Wales and Covenanted churches in Wales. In the last episode, I looked at churches to the west of Builthwells, where I saw many beautiful buildings in settlements like Llanarvan Fawr, Llantid, Llangammarch Wells and more. In this episode, I will look at churches that are situated between Builthwells and Brecon. I am Fabian Mustoe, and I present you the first season of Churches of Wales. In order to find these churches, I will use the Ordnance Survey map on Geograph as my reference for spotting church symbols, from maps of the 1920s, to maps of the 2010s and 20s. I apologize if some of my pronunciations of these place names are incorrect, since I am not a Welsh speaker. The first place I am at is situated 2 miles south from Builthwells, and the Church of St. David is situated in a setting with brilliant views of the mountainside to the south. The church is by the B4520 road and was first mentioned in 1183, although nothing of that building survives. The west tower is the earliest feature of the present building, dating from the 13th or 14th century. The church was heavily restored in 1847, when the nave was rebuilt by Joshua Daniels, and the chancel arch and east end were rebuilt in 1913, although the chancel has medieval origins. The church was Grade II listed in July 2000. A mile northwest is the Church of St. David, first built in the medieval times. This building was in a dilapidated state in the early 19th century, according to Theophilus Evans, and it was in ruins later that century. The building was rebuilt in 1878, and nothing remains from the medieval building except a number of 18th century memorials. The church was refurbished by Harry Harvey in 1963, when he installed the 5 painted reredos panels and stained glass in the east window. The church does not have listed status as of December 2022, which means the building can be demolished at any point. This is what happened to the Salem Independent Chapel some 2 miles south, first built in 1826 and rebuilt in 1874. The building housed a United Reformed Church until the 2010s, when it was demolished to its foundations. A mile south is the site of St. Kynog in Llangynog, built in the late medieval times or late 18th century. Situated by the B4520 road, the building consisted of a nave and chancel with no division, bellcote and north porch. The church was rebuilt in 1882 and closed for divine service in 1916. It was deconsecrated in 1963, and was demolished the following year, leaving a few gravestones and churchyard wall. 4 miles southwest is the Congregational Independent Chapel, first built in 1805 and rebuilt in 1871. Built in the vernacular style, the Ebenezer Chapel houses a United Reformed Church as of 2022. The church is situated a mile northwest from the settlement of Upper Chapel, which is by the B4520 road. This hamlet had a church from the early 19th century, presumably built on the site of a medieval chapel of ease. The building is surrounded by many trees, including a veteran female yew tree. The church closed as a place of worship in the 2010s, and was subsequently deconsecrated in late 2021. Here is the parish church of St. Kynog in Merthyr Kynog, established by the patron saint in the late 5th century AD and is presumably buried in the churchyard here. His shrine is at the church and his feast day is held on 9th October, and the church building dates from the 14th century. The building plan consists of a nave and chancel, and the interior houses a chancel screen of 3 bays, dating from the 14th century. The church was restored from 1860 to 62 by Charles Buckeridge and was Grade II star listed in January 1963. The churchyard consists of 6 male yew trees. Northeast from the hamlet is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, first built in 1791, and rebuilt in 1865 of the simple round-headed style. The churchyard at the chapel is situated opposite the building. Placed by the confluence of two rivers is a Calvinist Methodist chapel, first built in 1840 and rebuilt in 1869 of the vernacular style. The building later housed an English Presbyterian church in recent decades. West from the B4520 road is the Church of St. Michael in Lower Chapel, built in 1790 for the Powell family at Castle Maddock. This was mainly rebuilt from 1863 to 65 by Thomas Nicholson of Hereford, and the sanctuary was refurbished in 1963 by George Pace and Ronald Sims. Tens of yards south from the church is the Calvinist Methodist Chapel, and there were two earlier chapel buildings on the site, dating from 1810 and 1815. The present building dates from 1857, but the south face was remodeled in 1910, when it became the main facade. A few miles north is a former Congregational Independent Chapel, first built in 1841 and rebuilt in 1862. The Bethania Church was rebuilt again in 1877, and this housed a United Reformed Church before it was deconsecrated in the 2000s. South from Lower Chapel is a Baptist church by the B4520 road, first built in 1841 and rebuilt in 1855. This is in the simple round-headed style, and the building was rendered during the 2010s. The chapel and vestry were Grade II listed in February 2005. East from the chapel is St. David Church, which has origins to the 13th century. This was altered in the 17th and 19th century, when the West Bell Tower was added in the 17th century. The church was restored by William Jones, from 1833 to 34, when the north aisle was removed, and the church was Grade II star listed in July 2003. The church closed for worship in the early 2010s and was deconsecrated in 2021. Here is a church by the B4520 road and confluence of two rivers, dedicated to this saint who lived in the 6th century AD. This was first built in the late medieval times, and the West Bell Tower dates from the 16th century. The body of the church was rebuilt in 1831 by John Maund of Brecon, then rebuilt for the second time by W.G. and E. Habersham of Newport in 1856. The church houses a cross slab in the bell tower, dating from the 8th or 10th century with Latin inscription. This was fixed in the west wall of the Watkins Mausoleum, built in 1818 by the Reverend Thomas Watkins of this nearby country house in Battle. This mausoleum is in a dilapidated state, although it was Grade II listed with the churchyard cross and Dickinson family vault in February 2005. The church was Grade II star listed at the same time. 2.5 miles southwest is the village of Battle, which had a church dedicated to St. Kinnog, built near the site of a battle fort in 1092, which gave the settlement its name. This was built around or before the 15th century, and this was restored by J. B. Fowler of Brecon in 1880. Prior to this, the church had no chancel. The church was Grade II listed in April 1966, and closed for worship in the early 2010s when it was deconsecrated afterwards. This tall high Victorian church is by the River Usk, and this was designed by Charles Buckeridge in 1860. This is dedicated to two saints, one is St. Mary, and the other is a 6th century saint who was the first Bishop of Glasbury. The church site is situated west from Brecon Jai Roman Fort, and the building was built on the site of an earlier church from the 12th century, with the north door of the 15th century intact. The internal walls are plastered, except the west end which has a floor slab from the 15th century. The building was Grade II listed in March 2005, and north from the church is a former Congregational Independent Chapel, built in 1838, and rebuilt in 1904. This was converted to a private house by 2000. The parish church in Tralong is dedicated to St. David, first built in the 14th and 15th century. This was rebuilt by Charles Buckeridge in 1861, who built it for the Reverend Gilbert Harries of this village, who opposed the planned demolition of the medieval church. The interior houses an early Christian incised stone, found during the rebuilding of 1861 when it was used as a jamb stone in one of the windows. This dates from the 5th or early 6th century AD. The church was Grade II listed in December 2000, and west from there is the Calvinistic Methodist Chapel of 1831. The Salem Chapel housed a place of worship until the late 20th century, when it was derelict until the 2010s, when it was restored and converted into a private house. North from that village is the Saw Baptist Chapel from 1827, altered in 1874 and is situated by a river. The rural chapel is still a place of worship, and the chapel was Grade II listed in May 2005. 3 miles northwest from Saw is this village, which has a church dedicated to St. Michael. This was built as a rebuild of the medieval church by J. L. Pearson in 1882, and he preserved the west bell tower of the medieval times. The building plan consists of a nave and chancel, and Pearson inserted a unique timber chancel screen, which consists of tracery on the open outer panels. This was Grade II listed in May 2005, along with the Bethel Calvinistic Methodist Chapel, situated west from the church. This was first built in 1811 and rebuilt in 1866, and the chapel was Grade II listed in March 2000, although the interior of the building was gutted later that year. 2 miles north from the village is the site of a Baptist chapel, first built in 1822 and rebuilt in 1862. The chapel held their last service in July 1994, and the building was demolished afterwards. Several miles west is the foundations of a Calvinistic Methodist chapel, built in 1857 of the vernacular style. This closed for worship in 1940, since the site is within the military training area by the Ministry of Defense. The building was demolished that year, and 2 memorial plaques were added at the site in 1996. Placed by the confluence of 2 rivers is the Church of St. Tylo, built from 1873 to 75 by Thomas Nicholson on the site of a ruined medieval church. The interior houses a 14th century octagonal font and remnant of a late medieval screen, the latter borrowed from this church in 1957. The church was Grade II listed in October 2005, and east from there is the site of a primitive Methodist chapel, built in the 19th century. This closed for worship in the 20th century, and was demolished in 2004. 1.5 miles south is a Calvinistic Methodist chapel, first built in 1800 and rebuilt in 1858 of the simple round-headed style. This rebuild retains the long wall appearance of the first building, and the interior consists of paneled box pews stepped back in 5 steps. The small stable and vestry were added as part of the rebuild, and the chapel, forecourt wall and railings were Grade II listed in February 1998. 2 miles south is another Calvinistic Methodist chapel, situated north of this river. The Saw Chapel was first built in 1823 and rebuilt in 1881, although the rebuild is based on the first building. Placed by Sennybridge is a chapel of ease north of the River Usk, built in the 18th or 19th century. The building was altered in 1860, when a vestry and porch were added, and the chapel was presumably built to serve this nearby country house. Placed by the A40 road is the Salem Independent Chapel, built in 1918 in the sub-classical style. This building housed a place of worship for some decades, and by 1980 the building was converted into shops. There is a Sion Baptist Chapel by the A40 road, built in 1859 of the Gothic style. The chapel closed for worship in 1980 and is now a private house, which was Grade II listed in March 2000. Here is the parish church of St. Kinnog in Devinock, dating from the late 15th century when the west bell tower was added. The building replaced an earlier church from the 12th century, and the churchyard is home to 4 yew trees. The largest of these are in the north end of the churchyard, and these have the appearance of two trees, but they are genetically identical. The tree was claimed to be 5,000 years old, but research by the Ancient Yew group says the yews are fragments of the trunk of one large prehistoric trunk, and the actual age of the tree may be between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. The church interior has a font from around the early 12th century, which contains the only runic carving in Wales, and in the south porch is an incised stone with inscription from the 5th or 6th century AD, although the ring cross was added in the 9th or 10th century. The building plan consists of a nave, chancel and north chapel, dating from the 14th century, and the chapel was added in the 15th century. The west end of the nave was dominated with a gallery, which was demolished when the church was restored from 1888 to 1990, and the church was Grade 1 listed in January 1963. South of the church is the site of a Wesleyan Methodist chapel, first built in 1809 and rebuilt in 1873. The site of the chapel is by a stone bridge spanning the River Senne, and the chapel building was possibly demolished in the late 20th century. East of that chapel is another demolished chapel in Devenock, and this was the Tabernacle Independent Chapel. Built in 1865 of the subclassical style by Thomas of Landora, the chapel closed for worship in 1989, and the building was demolished 3 years later. The Trinity Chapel building east of the A4215 road is intact, although the chapel closed as a place of worship during the 2000s. This was first built in 1793 and rebuilt in 1829, then it was rebuilt again in the simple round-headed style in 1888. This Calvinist Methodist chapel was converted to secular use in 2011. Some 2 miles east from Devenock is a rural independent chapel and United Reformed Church, and the present building on the site dates from 1860. The windows on the south face are from the first chapel building of 1840, and the chapel was Grade 2 listed in February 1998. South of the A40 road at Trecastle is the Calvinist Methodist Chapel on Chapel Street, first built in 1765 and rebuilt in the simple round-headed style in 1825. The building was extended in 1963. The Saw Independent Chapel is northwest from the Methodist Chapel, and this was first built in 1850. The building was rebuilt in 1914 of the classical style, and the chapel closed as a place of worship in the late 20th century. A mile northwest from Trecastle is the parish church of St. David, which was presumably established by this saint who gave the settlement its name. The building mainly dates from the late 15th century, although the West Bell Tower may have been built in the 14th century. The reredos in the east end of the chancel consists of Victorian tiles by William Godwin of Herefordshire, England, and one of the vicars of this community, Lewis James, discovered an ogham stone near Trecastle in the 1870s. This was acquired by the British Museum of London in 1878, where it is on display, but there is a replica of the stone in the church. The church was Grade 1 listed in January 1963, and northwest from the church is the site of a Calvinist Methodist chapel. This was built in 1870, but the building was in a dilapidated state by the late 20th century. There is an independent chapel north of the River Usk, and this building was built in 1856 of the vernacular style. This building replaced an earlier chapel from 1822, and the chapel is situated a mile east from Usk Reservoir. A mile southeast is the Church of St. Mary, built from 1888 to 89 to the designs of J.B. Fowler of Cardiff. The chancel was added in 1903, and the church is situated by a confluence of 2 rivers. This does not have listed status as of 2022. Here is the church in Betws Penpont, built from 1864 to 65 by Sir George Gilbert Scott. This replaced an earlier church that was first recorded in 1547, when it was a chapelry of this settlement. The old church was restored in 1728 and 1789, then restored for the last time in 1835 when the organ chamber or vestry was added to the south. The present organ chamber houses an organ by Flight and Robson of London, manufactured in 1804 for the Royal Pavilion in Brighton. This moved to Betws Penpont Church in 1886, although the organ was rebuilt by Vowles and Son in 1967, they retained the Georgian case from the first organ. The church was Grade II listed in January 1963, and is situated by the A40 road. Also placed by that road is this church that is 3 miles east from Betws Penpont, built in the 14th century and restored from 1879 to 80 by F.R. Kempson, to the designs of 1870 by the late Charles Buckeridge. The plan has a north porch that dates from the 14th century, and the church was Grade II listed in January 1963. South of the village is the site of a Baptist chapel, which faces a stone bridge spanning the River Tyrrell to the north. The chapel was first built in 1770 and rebuilt in 1840, and this possibly closed for worship during the mid-20th century. West from the A470 road is the former Church of St. John, which was deconsecrated from 2018 to 2019. This was built from 1890 to 91 to the designs of F.R. Kempson and J.B. Fowler, and the church closed as a place of worship during the early 2010s. South of the church is the Congregational Independent Chapel, first built in 1823 and rebuilt in 1860 and 1880. This was rebuilt again from 1972 to 1973, and the United Reformed Church is situated east from the A470 road. The last building I will look at in this episode is the site of a remote church, dedicated to this saint who gave the settlement its name. Built as a chapel in the 19th century or earlier, the church building was demolished during the 1990s, and this aerial photograph shows the building in 1989. I am back at Upper Chapel to end this episode, with the old village church sitting to my left. I enjoyed looking at religious buildings from Bilthwells to Brecon, and I will continue looking at them in the next episode as I head northeast from Brecon to Hay on Wye.